All right, so today is a special day. As Brad mentioned, we're going to be ordaining some elders. But before we do that, what I wanted to do was kind of take a look at what leadership looks like in the life of a person. So I know over the last couple weeks, obviously as a family of churches, we've been doing this series called The Family of Jesus, a series on the church. What is the church? Who are elders? Who are deacons? What do they do? All that good stuff. And what I want to do today is kind of take us from, I want to take some of these ideas that might feel like they're up in the clouds at times and kind of see them applied in a flesh and blood person. And that flesh and blood person we're going to look at is the Apostle Paul. We're going to see it the way that he showed up in a church family. Again, as a church, as a family of churches, we believe that church is a family. It's one of our values. As a matter of fact, it's the most dominant metaphor for church in the New Testament, the household of God. And it's an important concept because families can help us or they can hurt us. And the leadership of families can help us or hurt us. A few years back, I did a year-long counseling trainers for pastors. It was called the Redeemer Counseling Fellows Program with Redeemer Counseling Center in New York City. And it was designed to teach people, especially pastors, who have kind of well-developed theology, but little counseling skills. And it trains them in clinical skills and concepts to know how to come alongside, especially tricky situations when people are experiencing things like complex trauma or addiction or abuse or serious mental health situations. Most pastors aren't trained to deal with any of that stuff, and they don't know, what to do. And so what we would do is we'd learn about a topic and then a clinical skill. So for example, we learn about addiction in general, how it works, the cycle of addiction, and then how getting sober works. And then we learn a clinical skill. So there's something called motivational interviewing, where you basically help people find the motivation in themselves to deal with their addiction versus like pressuring them to do it. And one of the things that we learned about was a thing called Bowen Family Systems Theory. And since then, I've done extensive training on Bowen theory because it unpacks how groups of people interact with each other. And as a pastor, I'm leading groups and I'm constantly aware of group dynamics. And a core idea in Bowen Family Systems Theory is that often unhealthy people are unhealthy because of the system that they're living in or the family that they're in. So they go, a lot of kind of approaches to therapy or counseling, whatever, would go, the problem's inside of you, we got to fix you, and they don't think through the context of the person. Where Bowen, with Bowen Systems does is it goes, hey, right now, the way that you're interacting with the people around you is impacting you and you're impacting them, which is a very biblical idea, the way that the body of Christ works, that we have different parts, that we impact one another. And so one of the ideas is that rather than focusing on the sick individual, we should focus in on the dynamic and the relational processes in the group. And oftentimes, what makes a dysfunctional family dysfunctional is the fact that the most unhealthy person has the most power. So what makes a dysfunctional family dysfunctional often is that the person who's the least healthy has the most power. The person with an addiction or an untreated mental health issue, or an abuser has the most power. Kind of everyone tiptoes around them or acquiesces to them. This is also true in the church, which we believe is a spiritual family. When there are unhealthy leaders, there will be unhealthy churches. So many times, again, you can't have a healthy family with unhealthy parents. It's the same thing in the church. And one of the things that the Apostle Paul is going to say again today is that spiritual leadership or eldership, the thing we're talking about today, it's like parenting. It's spiritual parenting. Now, some of us were like, my parents were not good. I don't need another set, right? I've had a parent and it was not good, right? Or I had really good parents. I'm good. I'm good. But again, in the church, it's this idea of spiritual parenting. And so, again, what's true in the family is true in the church. Now, what you need to know is this is a healthy church. Like it really is. This is a healthy church. I want to say that. Oftentimes when you're in a community, you can kind of like take it for granted or not see clearly all that's happening, and a ton of beautiful things are happening in this church. Does that make sense? Just like you can take for granted the physical family you live with, you can take for granted the church that you are in. You get used to a lot of beautiful things, and you don't realize that they're not the norm. And there's a lot of beautiful things about this church that are not the norm. But what you need to know is this is a healthy church, and it's a healthy church because it's led by healthy leaders. Now, don't hear what I didn't say. It's not a perfect church. It's not a perfect church. There's no such thing as a perfect church. There's no such thing as a perfect body. I don't care how often you go to the gym, right? If you go to a doctor and they're going to tell you, you want to hear healthy, not you're perfect. Everyone's body is, not, over time, you're aging and all that stuff. And so the core idea is that we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for health. And the reason that this is a healthy church is because it has healthy leaders. This church has healthy leaders who love Jesus and love his church. Like, I don't think you guys realize, maybe you do, but I just want to make it really clear. I'm blown away by Stephen John's leadership and Brad Sarian's leadership as elders. Like, genuinely, you can give it up for them. Yeah. I work with churches, church teams all over the world, and I have for a very long time. And I'm just telling you, to have humble, loving leaders who care is more rare than you know. And then they're gifted on top of it. And so you guys do have a good thing. But that being said, this church has continued to grow, which is a really beautiful thing, which means just two people cannot continue to be the only. Does that make sense? And so that's what today's all about, is about appointing leaders, appointing elders, because who leads in the church is a really big deal. Too often I have seen churches appoint people either too quickly or for the wrong reasons. Again, and this happens, you can see how this happens, right? Like in larger, more established churches, the reason that often that they appoint leaders too quickly is because the church is growing, and like, man, we need leaders, right? And we need more programs and more ministries because there's more people, and it's kind of good, right? Like we want to serve more people better, essentially. But what can come, the cost that can come with is you start to take shortcuts and you start appointing people really, really fast. And the Bible says not to do this. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 22 through 25, it says, do not be hasty. Don't do this too quickly. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, nor take part in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. The sins of some people are conspicuous, going before them to judgment, but the sins of others appear later. So also good works are conspicuous, and even those that are not cannot remain hidden. So what Paul is saying is it takes time to assess someone's character. You need to observe their life over time, their relationships, their tendencies, their repentance, their love for the church, their love for Jesus, or their love for power. Some people, he says, are obviously unqualified to be leaders. Their sins are conspicuous, like you'd see them from a mile away. Like that guy's a jerk, right? You know. Some people, though, and this is where it gets really heartbreaking, look like angels, but they're monsters. If you're with them long enough. Some of you guys have been wounded deeply by leaders or people who pretended. Maybe it was a parent. At church, they acted one way, and they hurt you at home. And some pastors look really good on a Sunday, and they hurt you behind the scenes. But Paul also says, on the flip side, there are people whose sins, there's people whose good works are inconspicuous. Like you don't notice them, right? Like they aren't super impressive. They don't have like Bible trivia down. They're not at every event. But man, you look at their life and there is a purity to them. There's a prayer life that they have. There's generosity in them. There's a desire to see peacemaking happen in the life of the church. And so like wherever they go, love kind of follows. Wherever they go, people love each other and Jesus more. Like they're not perfect, but they're mature. So Paul says, over time, you see who someone really is. When I do premarital counseling with couples, one of the things I ask is, have you guys ever had like a really big conflict yet? If they say no, I go, you should not get married till you've had one. Because you don't really know each other, right? And that's the reality here. Paul's saying, over time, you get to know who people really are. So the key idea, again, is who leads in the local church is a big deal. Now, over the past few weeks, again, you guys have been looking at these different qualifications and what you've been looking at who is qualified to be an elder and why, essentially. Who's qualified to be a deacon and why, what the church is and how it works biblically. What I want to do, again, is take those ideas and apply them to a person. And I want to apply them to the Apostle Paul. I'm going to look at how he led, what his leadership was like. And to do that, we're going to look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. One of my favorite books in the Bible. It's slowly become near and dear to my heart. And I remember one of my Bible college professors told me when we were studying 1 Thessalonians, he said, listen, in Ephesians and Romans, we see clearly the theology of Paul the preacher. But he said in 1 Thessalonians, we see clearly the heart of Paul the leader. So what I want to do is I want to read verses 1 through 12. Today's not going to be a nitty-gritty deep dive into the Greek, into the context. If you guys are here, if you're familiar with the teaching ministry of this church, Brad does an excellent job consistently of diving and working through passages. Today, what I want to do is just paint a picture, if you will, of what leadership can look like and what we hope it looks like in the life of this church. as we get to ordain leaders. It says, "For you yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our visit with you was not without results. On the contrary, after we had previously suffered and were treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know, we were emboldened by our God to speak the gospel of God to you in spite of great opposition. For our exhortation didn't come from error or impurity or an intent to deceive. Instead, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please people, but rather God who examines our hearts. For we never used flattering speech, as you know, or had greedy motives. God is our witness. And we didn't seek glory from people, either from you or from others. Although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you as a mother nurtures her own children. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our very own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, brothers and sisters, working night and day so that we would not burden any of you. We preached God's gospel to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. As you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each of you to walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." And so today we've got 5 kind of core ideas. We'll move through them fairly quickly. But my outline is this. It's the portrait of a healthy leader. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the courage and the compassion and the canvas and something else, which we'll get to later. But the first thing I want to point out, if you look at verses 1 and 2, I want to talk about this idea of Paul's courage. And honestly, if you think through and think about Paul in this passage, he's really saying, if you notice this, he references being a mother and a father. He's saying spiritual leadership is more like parenting than it is CEO leadership. It's more like parenting than being a general of a military. And so I think one of the ways that we can think about this is, what do good parents do? Right? What do good parents on their best days do? And so we see this here. There's courage. Again, Paul says he speaks in spite of great opposition. Even in the face of great opposition, Paul speaks the truth, even if it's going to cost him. And for him, when he said that they were opposed, it's not talking about like they didn't like him, or they cut his mic off, or they said, boo, they left the church. He's talking about like one time he got stoned and left for dead. Like people threw rocks at him, not smoked weed, right? Like he got hit with rocks till they thought he was dead for preaching the gospel, and he doesn't back down even if it's going to cost him. Again, spiritual leadership being like parenting, Paul's going, man, I'll do whatever it takes to care for you. I'm at my most brave and courageous when I think my family is being threatened. I'm not the bravest guy in the world, but if you're coming at my family, I probably, right? I might be able to take you if you're small enough. If there's 2 of you, I'm down to get beat up for them. You know what I mean? I don't have any jujitsu, whatever, Krav Maga or anything like that, right? But if we hear a noise in the middle of the night, I'm popping up, right? And this is true of good leaders. It's not a machismo kind of staring people down, pulling up at red lights, like, you want to fight? It's not that. It's, hey, if you try to hurt my kids, I'm going to hurt you. Or you're going to have to hurt me first, right? And we see this. And in spiritual leadership, this is true. Sometimes it's true physically. I know of a church where elders died stopping gunmen to keep people from entering the church. They were in the foyer, and they blocked people from coming in. But the lie of the enemy, or the enemy's greatest weapon is lies. And one of the ways that we protect the church as leaders is courageously confronting false teaching. And this is one of the things that I love about Brad is Brad, his sermons are him protecting you, whether you realize it or not. He courageously protects you every time he preaches. Because you might not know this, but beliefs shape you. And there's a ton of messages floating around the news and social media and political parties that will ruin your life if you grab hold of them. Messages that run opposed to the gospel of Jesus. And one thing Brad does consistently in this church is he tells you not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear, right? Now, again, as a parent, I have to deal with the opposition of my kids sometimes, right? Like if I said, hey, you guys want to eat, what do you want for dinner? Ice cream every night, right? But no, I need to give them vegetables. I need to give them things that are good for them. Again, when it comes to Brad, he's like a good dad. He's going, hey, there are beliefs and practices that are bad for you and ones that are good for you. And everyone's telling you this is good for you, but Jesus calls us to something greater. So there's courage. There's also consistency. Paul says they don't use flattery. They're not different with different people. They aren't trying to gain things from those they lead. They aren't trying to get their own needs met by leading in the church, which is how abuse happens in churches. They understand this work isn't about them. It's about Jesus first and foremost. And it's about his people second, and it's about the leader third. One of the best analogies I've ever heard for this idea is that leaders are friends of the bridegroom. And the idea is that the church is the bride, and Jesus is the groom, and we're the groom's friend, right? When the wedding happens, no one's going to be looking at us. Like, look at the best man, right? Look at that best man. You've never been to a wedding and been like, man, maybe if you're, I don't know, maybe you're a single lady, you're like, look at that best man, right? But generally, we know where the attention should be. It's on the bride and the bridegroom. And so leaders should know, I never should do anything to this bride that the bridegroom would not be okay with. And my job is to point her to Jesus, not be a creepy leader that's like, hey, you're marrying him, but I'm pretty cool too, right? We don't share the glory with Jesus. We go, it's about him and only him. The second thing is compassion. True spiritual leaders have compassion. Verse 7 says, although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, instead we were gentle among you as a mother nursing her own children, right? Kind of wild, right? Like if you got an email from your pastor, he's like, man, I feel like I just nursed you this weekend. Like a nursing mother with her own, that sermon, I felt it, you know what I mean? Now, as awkward as it might say, it's the Bible. As awkward as it might sound, the core idea here is there's a gentleness, and there isn't, in Christian leadership in the church, there should not be an ends justify the means mentality. I was like, oh, I fed them, they're fine. No, it's we feed them in a gentle way. We feed people in such a way where they can receive what it is we're trying to give them. And we're doing it for their good, not our own. Does that make sense? And so there's this compassion to go, hey, what do people need? And helping them get what they need, even if it's at great cost to ourselves. So a lot of young moms in this church, when they're up late at night, it's not for their benefit. They're like, you know what I want to do? Get up late and do that. You know what I mean? But it's a sacrifice that's built on a love for the child. And Christian leadership's the same way. I think one of the reasons why we've had so many issues with leaders in the churches, we primarily think of leadership as just being the top dog on the top of like a org chart. And we've taken a lot of business practices from the world, right? And we're like, do you want to be the next Steve Jobs, Jesus style, right? And again, narcissists will be attracted to that like a moth to a flame. Do you want to be in charge of people? That's what pastors are. Does that make sense? Where it's like, no, pastors have authority that's for the good of those they're serving. Again, it's like a parent. They have authority, but it exists for those who are underneath that authority. If you have children just so you can boss someone around, you shouldn't have children. Like, man, no one listens to me. I should have some kids, right? Also, you got like a max 9 years on that before it gets complicated, Unless it's real weird, right? And so, no, our authority exists for their benefit, to protect them, to keep them safe, to get them what they need, to help them grow up to maturity, right? So again, last thing I'll say on this, Christian leaders, this picture of nurturing gently, they're not always going to make you feel good, but they're going to give you what you need to mature as you work through your spiritual developmental phases. Even when they have hard conversations, it's probably awkward for them, and they're doing it for your benefit. Does that make sense? The fourth thing is a canvas. Paul said we cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember our labor and hardship, working night and day. Verse 10 says this. He says, you are witnesses, and so is God, of how devoutly, righteously, and blamelessly we conducted ourselves with you believers. In other words, their lives were observable. Did you catch that? He's like, you guys were witnesses. You know me. You've seen me. I shared my life with you. I opened up my life to you. And you can even look at, you remember, like take a look at everything. You saw the way I live when people are accusing me of stuff. You know it's not true because you were there. You saw me. And so spiritual leaders should be accessible and observable. Now, in a church of a couple hundred like this one, it's not possible for everyone to like get time with Brad every day, right? But this is why we need more elders, right? Like you got to have someone who you can learn from and see. Again, this idea of canvases, you're an example. You're painting a picture to the other members of the church. Here's what it looks like to be a mature Christian. Not a perfect Christian, a mature Christian. Does that make sense? You're being an example. And the only way to receive an example is to be able to see the example, to experience the example. Most of the lessons we learn as kids are implicit lessons that you watch modeled, not taught. You ever heard of the phrase caught, not taught? That's so much of life and discipleship and parenting and ministry. Your kids pick up what you do, not what you say. So like, you should eat healthy, and you just always eat just California burritos all day. They're like, man, I just feel like I think we should eat California burritos every day, Dad. You're like, where'd you get that from? They're like, we don't know, right? One time, our daughter said the S word, stubbed her toe, and I just thought, why would Jackie say that in front of her? You know what I mean? And, right? We never said, hey, you know what? You should say this word. She heard people stub their toe. She used it pretty accurately. And yeah, you know, so he's like, hey, not appropriate for you, your age, all that good stuff. So they catch and pick stuff up that we do, not always what we say. It's important that we say things, but we need to do it too. Now, again, one of the beauties of this church is Brad is not a leader who just says stuff, right? If you know anything about Brad and his discipleship to Jesus, he is about that life, right? Think about how he has chosen to lay down his rights and his privileges and the things he would want to do to become like Jesus. And in the same way, if you walked in what he is walking in, you would become like Jesus, honestly, right? You can't do that. You have different personality, different gender, different backstory, whatever, but there's a lot you could learn watching these men and women lead. That's what elders do. In the field of brain science, there's been in the last 25 years, there's been a lot of movement with the field of brain science, but one of the things that has gotten scientists really excited and counselors and stuff is the idea of mirror neurons. Have you guys ever heard of this, mirror neurons? So a neuron, fires when you're doing something, and it kind of reminds you, oh, this is what it's like to do this. You're training your brain to do something. Mirror neurons, again, it's kind of like you're looking at yourself in a mirror. It's the idea that you watch someone do something when you're not doing it, but your neuron fires like you did it yourself, even though you were just watching someone do it. Isn't that crazy? And so, for example, that's a lot of people think that's part of how we learn language, is we watch someone else do it, and it's almost like we're learning to speak as we watch them speak. It's how we learn empathy. Most people think like we experience an emotion, we see someone else experience an emotion, and then when they experience it later, we feel what they feel. Right? I know what it's like to be sad. I know what it's like to be angry or lonely or afraid or whatever it is. It's why when we watch movies, we cry, even though we know it's fake, and we know it's the music tricking us, right? But we're like, dang, right? Because we know what it's like to be heartbroken, or we know it, right? Every rom-com, you're like, I had a guy like that too that left me, You're like, I have a dream of a guy, running down the airport to find me. Back when you could come up to the gate before, it is what it is. So it's why the research says it's why sports fans get so embarrassed. My family's from Boston, right? So the Boston Celtics, right? You love them up here, right? It's why great franchises like the Boston Celtics and the Lakers have fans that feel so emotionally invested because like, man, we're champions, right? Boston sports fans go like, hey, we won the game last night. It's like, you weren't even in the state. You did not play, right? Right? Because again, when you watch, you're like, I know what it's like to play sports. Like literally, that's what happens to your brain. You're like, I know what it's like to dribble a basketball up a court. Not like that, but I know I've seen that before. I've done that. And literally, the mirror, you go like, I feel like I'm experiencing what they're experiencing, and their joy is mine, all that good stuff. Now, there's beautiful lessons we can learn from that for discipleship. Because a lot of us, we have some jacked up stuff we learned in our family of origin and in the society around us and the devil and the world, right? We have lies we've believed and ways of life we've grabbed. And we need examples, people that can live it out in front of us to show us what it looks like to be a mature person, to see people church leaders should be people that show you how to do conflict differently, even when they don't teach you it. Maybe they do it with you. I remember one time I I was preaching at a church, and you guys know who Preston Sprinkle is, the theology guy. He's kind of, yeah, I don't know. Well, he's a New Testament scholar, and he has a big podcast now and stuff. But back in the day, I just knew him as a Bible college professor, and I knew him as a very smart man, who had written stuff that's published and used in seminaries. And I was a professor, and I was preaching at a church he was visiting, and I'll never forget, I preached on the 12 apostles, and it's me preaching on the 12 apostles. It's not scholar level or whatever. And I was just so aware of him. And I actually said multiple times, I was like, hey, just so you guys know, you ask Preston. He's got the real answer, They're like, who's Preston? I don't get it. This guy's doing like shout outs in the back. And after the sermon, I just remember, it was actually at a urinal. It's kind of funny. I was in the bathroom, and then he walked in, and he just was like, hey, man, can I talk to you about your sermon? And I was like, oh, man, the correction's coming, right? And he just said, and I just start, before he even says, I go, hey, I know, I didn't talk enough about what a zealot is, the background context on zealots is like a military group. And he's like, I just wanted to say thank you. And that was the best sermon I've ever heard on the 12 apostles. And just so you know, too, like, I need God's grace in the Bible, just like anyone else, even if I know a lot of information. And, like, God used you today. So, like, thank you so much. Like, I think you provided clarity around these guys, and you, like, taught me about grace today. And, like, I wrote a book about grace that got published. A lot of, so I in that moment, what I learned was how to use your power for the good of others. Does that make sense? He didn't teach me. Hey, I'm going to teach you a lesson on, he did it. I felt the weight of, I was afraid. And he hadn't hurt me. I just assumed, man, he's here to correct me, and he was there to bless me. About 6 months ago, I met with a guy in our church, and he was so nervous to talk to me. He even wanted to ask me a question about basically like if I liked him and if I thought he had potential to be a leader, and he had some assumptions he wanted to check out. It was pretty mature of him to check it out, but he was nervous. And it had this vibe of like he was in the principal's office and he was in my office. And I could pick up on it. And this is me 15 years later now, leading, and I just said, hey, man, like, I feel like you seem like you're nervous. He said, yeah, because you're a leader. I said, okay. And I sat down on the floor across from him, and I said, hey, like, you should feel safe with me, and I exist for you, and I can learn things from you. Now, that's not a flex. I was so humble. He cried and was like, oh, my gosh, I do feel safe. And halfway through, he's like, you can sit up there. Like, I feel like you're safe. But my point is that's a lesson I learned implicitly from Preston that I got to give someone else. Elders should give those types of lessons with their example. And then the last point is this, they have a clear vision for people. Again, if it's spiritual parenting, just like parents are examples, you want to have a clear vision for people. Paul says, as you know, like a father with his own children, we encouraged, comforted, and implored each one of you to walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Healthy leaders, like healthy parents, see potential in those that are under their leadership and care. Like, I have ambition and vision for my kids. And it's not that they'd be rich or success, whatever. It's like I see the unique ways God's designed each of them, and I love to draw out who they could become. None of them are in gatherings, so I could talk about it. My other son, Clive, he's more introverted. He is so kind, and he's really good with his hands. He's a really good guitar player. One of the things he's been doing lately is he's been fixing other kids' bikes in the neighborhood. And then I'm like, and he taught himself that, and he's doing it, and it's working out. The other day, our doorknob was really like loose for like a week, and I was just way too busy. And I came back. He's like, "Hey, I tightened the doorknob, Dad, just so you know." I was like, "Oh man, it's like really cool." So we see these things happening. I'm like, man, this guy could invent something, be an engineer, teach things. I'm just so proud of him the way that he shows up for people. And then my middle son, Calvin, he's all right with his hands. He's very he's like me with his words. Says a lot of words. But I've watched him advocate for people and stick up for people. If you want to see him hot, and sometimes it's for, but if there's injustice, he'll stand up to it. I was talking to him the other day about a friend of mine whose parents grew up in China, communist China, and they had to pick their vocation at like age 12. He's like, I know what I would do. I'd be a lawyer. He's like, that'd be easy for me. And again, that's how he shows up. And I see that, I go, man, I'd love to see him use that for good. And then my daughter, Olivia, is just such a kind, compassionate, like caregiving, like she can't not like love and bless people. I remember one time someone came to our house and they were sad. They weren't using words. They were sad. They sat down and Olivia goes, hey, are you okay? You seem sad. They were there like for me and Jackie to meet with them, to like minister to them. She's like, oh, I kind of am. And then she prayed for them, asked if she could pray for them. That's how she shows up. So I have ambition for them. But here's the other thing. My kids have some strengths. We've been raising them for a while. They didn't start like this. There's an era for all three where we wipe their butts. Not my favorite era, right? Good parents should have patience for their kids' process, right? We do have more patience for our kids than other people. If you had a coworker that walked up to you once a week and kicked you in the shins, it'd be over, right? Like, it wouldn't be good. And then when you confront them on it, they start crying and say it's your fault, right? You're like, whoa, what kind of abusive relationship is this, right? Your kids do it. You have patience. And so good leaders don't put their people in a box going, because again, if you're showing up to church for real, you're vulnerable. You've got your sin, your pain, your wound. You're bringing it out over time as you feel safe to get the help you need from Jesus and his people. But to do that means people are going to see you real messy and real grimy and real like snot and tears. And also, embarrassingly, moments you snap at people and are reactive and you shut down and you're angry or you don't want to come around. All those things are happening and it can feel really exposing. And good leaders go, yep, that's where you are in your journey. And that's okay. I want more for you. I have ambition for the type of person you can become. But right now, this is where you're at. But I'm not going to put you in this box forever. My goal is to keep drawing you out even when you're nervous, to show you that you can be someone new. You can walk in a manner worthy of your calling. I remember once Brad and I went on a ministry trip to South Africa. We were in Durban, which is in the city. It's about 3 million people. And it's in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And they said, hey, we want you to go minister at this church. It's a country church. And we get there, and it's definitely a country church. We're staying in like a little ranch house that the walls didn't connect in some of the rooms. It was like an African farmhouse. And it was wild. Like I remember I got out to go to the bathroom and there was a frog in the toilet. At like 2 a.m, I was like, well, and I peed on the frog, guys. Confession. I don't know if it's a sin or not. I felt gross. But while I was doing that, this city boy was not ready for what was about to happen. My buddy, James, who was sleeping with me in a room with the door shut because we snored, so they gave us the room. He comes out, was awoken or something. He comes out, he goes, hey, tell me why the biggest moth in the world's in our room right now. It's like, whoa, big moth, disgusting. And then there's an Instagram video of this, and if it was a youth camp, I would show you the video. He's filming, and it's a lit up hallway, but a dark room. And then he goes, it's a bat! And a bat comes flying out. And almost hits us, whatever, it flies around. That was indoors. We were in a room for 3 hours with a bat. A small bedroom, we didn't know, right? So anyways, it's rural. The other thing you need to know, though, is this rural in that part of South Africa means very poor. It means ravished by AIDS. It means farmlands destroyed by flooding and not proper help to get them back on the ground, and a lack of economic investment. And so there's a lot going on there. And I go to preach, and I get there, and they go, oh, you're going to have a Zulu translator. I was like, oh, man, I talk fast as it is. Like, she better be on her game, right? And so we decided actually so this is what happened. So we do that. And then as people start coming into church, it's almost entirely children, like to the person. There's about, 8 to 10 women. They're bringing in these children. There's a couple of dudes in the back who feel like the worst church members ever because they're just like smoking cigarettes on their cell phones, walking back and forth, drinking, not cigarettes, just they weren't engaged at all. They're talking to each other, drinking coffee. And I go, hey, are those guys going to come in? And then the guy that leads the church, he says, oh, no, man, they're cab drivers. They have like buses. They drove all these people here. And so I'm realizing, oh, this is a church, and it's basically just kids. And some overworked women who had taken on way too much stuff. A lot of them are AIDS orphans and AIDS widows. And I'll never forget, we went to lunch that day with the pastor. And Tom Logue just asked, he said, hey, is there anyone in your church right now who has potential to be an elder? Like who you looking at in terms of potential? Like any kind of emerging young leaders, you see gifting and character and talent. And he goes, you know what? And they had a big field behind the farm. They were trying to renovate and get people work and feed people and stuff. And there was a big field, and they had a soccer field, and they had a basketball hoop that had no backboard. And he just said, my next few elders are probably about 10 years old, and they're probably playing soccer right now out there. That's a long-term vision for discipleship to renew an area. And good leaders go, man, I'm going to be patient with your process as you become like Jesus. And I'm going to pull you into the next stage sometimes. You're not going to like it, like good parents, but it's for your good, not for me. And so as we close, what I want to say is in this church, I do think you already have leaders like this.